If you've always had questions about how to dehydrate food to get a dry pantry just like this, today's your day. I'm talking with Leisa Sutton from Sutton's Days, where we discuss dehydrating. And I'm Darcy from the Purposeful Pantry, and I want to be your dehydrating BFF to teach you how to get this kind of food to store for your family for use all year long. So let's get started on those questions.
We're going to start off with some general questions about dehydrating, right?
Go for it.
How do dehydrated foods differ from other preserved foods like canned or frozen?
They are shelf stable. Frozen foods are not shelf stable. You run the risk of the freezer running, dying, or someone leaving a door open and then it defrosts, and you can't take it out and walk away with it. You have to keep it at perfect temperatures to keep it safe, and you have to cook it and all that kind of stuff. So freezer foods, that's the big difference. Now, with dehydrated versus canned, there are some things like portability, which means you can walk away with those foods and go someplace else and you don't have to carry around heavy glass jars. You can put more food into a space than you can with canned food. So the amount of jars that it would take to keep this many vegetables in one space, you would have like a whole shelf of canned foods. This is probably 5, 6, 7 meals worth of vegetables for making soup. So it's more compact, and I love that. And the fact that it's portable. And it is a better variety of things that you can dry than you can. So I can keep snacks that I can just pick up and eat that you can't really do canned the same way with the same kind of food. So I have a greater variety of things that I can do for dehydrated, but then there are things that you can that you can't dehydrate. So that's kind of like a one for the other. Okay. But yeah, those are the biggest things.
They're kind of like partners in crime.
Yeah.
Kind of like us. Okay. So which types of dehydrated foods are most commonly stored in pantries, do you think?
Okay, so probably for most people, like a lot of fruit, because they like to have apple rings or strawberry snacks or whatever. And those are the easy things that most people can do, because you can even do those in your oven. And people who don't have a dehydrator can use the oven to do that. Now it depends on how into dehydrating you are, how much food that you actually grow that you have to preserve. For me, I keep a lot of dehydrated foods on the shelf all the time. So I'm going to do this so you can see it. That is my dehydrating shelf. That's the most of it. I keep all my herbs someplace else, but this is my food that I go through all the time. So there's a ton. Could you see it?
I saw the marshmallows.
Okay. Yeah, there's marshmallows in there. So I keep an amazing amount of food in my pantry that I rotate through often. And it is stuff that I can put in meals anytime. It is also stuff that I can snack on, or my family can snack on. And then it's stuff that I can powder to put extra nutrients into foods that my family doesn't eat already. That's the primary reason why I dehydrate. I have a family full of people who all have very big texture issues with food or have dietary restrictions that makes it to where I have to do things different for them. So in order for me to get in order for me to get vegetables and greens into the diet of a good majority of my family, I have to do something sneaky. So I powder stuff. So what you see right here is a jar full of greens that are turnip greens, parsley, what else is in here? Spinach, there's some kale. And what I will do is take this and grind it into a powder so I can just add that to everything that we cook, even our brownies, because I'm really famous for the fact that I put green stuff in the brownies, and it's safe green stuff, not the fun green stuff. And so that I can make sure that in everything that we eat, I'm getting those nutrients in my family when they wouldn't eat it before. So so I put everything I can possibly dehydrate is on the shelf in my pantry.
Okay, so let's talk about nutrition, because we're all about nutrition, right?
Mm-hmm.
Do dehydrated foods retain their nutritional value compared to fresh foods?
Okay, compared to fresh foods, if you cook them, it all happens the same. You're going to lose those particular nutrients for heat. You lose vitamin A and C over extended amount of time exposed to heat. So if you're that concerned about that, eat some fresh food and you're fine. Like, eat fresh food. Don't even cook it. Just eat it fresh. Dehydrated foods will also lose vitamin B when you blanch them. When you expose them to kind of water heat, you start losing all your water-soluble vitamins, and B is the big one. So then use that blanching water to cook something else with later, and you kind of regain that. So if you dry things under 115F, which is 43C, the lower the better, you retain all the nutrients. It's called living or raw food, so that you can store it that way with all of the nutrients still there. So if you're snacking on the stuff later, you still retain those nutrients. Now, when you cook it later, you're still going to lose some of those vitamins in the same way that you would if you dehydrate it at a hotter temperature. So But fresh food stored over amount of time start to lose their nutrients too. So if you've had something in their refrigerator for a week or a week and a half, it's lost a lot of nutrients during that time because that's just what happens. So
Okay.
dehydrating low and slow, you're good.
Okay. Sticking with nutrition, how can dehydrated foods contribute to a balanced diet?
In my family, like we talked about before, I'm putting nutrients in there that they wouldn't eat normally. So I'm getting more stuff in there all the time. Now, a balanced diet, if you want to look at the fact that you may be eating vegetables that you grew over the summer that you can eat during the winter that you're getting that are not, they're not fresh because you preserve them. But you may be able to have a greater variety of food during the winter than you would have had if you didn't have that stuff put away, which gives you a greater variety of nutrients. Now, yes, you can go buy it from the grocery store, but typically that's going to cost a whole lot more money because it's out of season and that stuff has been shipped. That stuff has been stored for a long time before it even gets shipped to you. So is the nutrient quality, is great there.
Awesome. Okay. Practical usage, because, it's important. What are the best ways to incorporate dehydrated foods into everyday meals?
Okay.
If you're not used to it, starting brand new.
Right. So this is probably the biggest question everybody has. I dried it, so what do I do with it? And my answer almost always is, what did you do with it when it was fresh? Because that's typically is what you're going to do with it when it's dry. If you cook casseroles or soups or stovetop meals or stuff in the oven or meatloaf, the dehydrated food, the fresh food that you put in those things, use the dehydrated version instead. Sometimes you have to rehydrate it ahead of time to make it easier to use. So you might want to put it in some water or some broth, let it soften up, let it rehydrate, then use it in your cooking. It's the same as if you use that food when it was fresh. It doesn't really change anything. You don't have to make special meals just to use dehydrated foods. You don't have to create some kind of special whole dehydrated thing that you can only cook with when it was dehydrated. You can just incorporate those ingredients just like you did when it was fresh. You just maybe have to do the rehydration first because sometimes it needs that time to rehydrate and the time to cook in order for it to come back so that it's not chewy and stuff. And then the other thing that I do all the time is powder. I powder a ton. I don't do all my vegetables, but if I have leftovers, I'll stick them into a jar, kind of like when you're doing vegetable stock and you stick those vegetables in the freezer waiting to make stock.
Yeah.
I have jars full of food that it's like I have a little bit left, so I'll stick it in there and I just start collecting it. When I get enough, I powder it and put it in my vegetable powder jar. Then when I cook it a meal, I'll take a scoop or two out of there, throw it in the meal, and I've just added a ton of vegetables without having to do prep work, without anybody knowing that I added those vegetables in there, because my husband knew how many peas he actually eats on a daily basis that he will not eat. He would be astounded. Thankfully, he knows I do it. I don't hide that from my family. They know I do it, but they don't know what they're getting. So that's always a good thing. It's a great way to incorporate stuff into a meal when you have picky eaters, if you just are really wanting to get that food in them.
Awesome. Okay, so you kind of covered this, but how do you rehydrate dehydrated foods effectively for cooking or consumption?
Okay, so what I do for the most part is I will take a jar, put that food in the jar and put it in the refrigerator with some water on it and let it sit overnight. If I am prepared enough to know what I'm cooking the next night to have something ready, because it's the least amount of work, I can either use that water in what I'm making because then I'm collecting whatever's come out,
Right.
Or I can toss it if I just don't have use for it. But usually I at least go water the garden with that water. Or in the morning when I'm kind of thinking ahead about dinner, I can do it in the morning and it still has the whole day to do that. But if it's a denser vegetable, they usually need a little help. So you can put it in a pot with some broth or water and simmer it. So you're adding the heat to it to help it expand and cook and rehydrate at the same time. If you're going to do something like a soup, you can put all those vegetables in there. When you start the soup, put the broth in and let it go for a while because you don't want to do it instant because that stuff needs time to cook. What you don't want to do is add vegetables into a stovetop meal at the end, thinking that you've got enough time that, oh yeah, they look good, they're going to be chewy, and they're not going to be very good. You need to give it time, which is why you do it ahead of time as much as you can. I will often either have a little pot going, like if I'm making cottage pie, which is meat and vegetables with a mashed potato topping. It's a favorite of ours. I will go ahead and let those vegetables go in a pot with some broth and let them get done while I'm cooking the meat if I'm using fresh meat at the time.
So how versatile do you think are dehydrated foods in terms of culinary applications?
Well, it depends. I mean, you can dry things for like garnishes for drinks. I know a lot of bartenders are really getting into dehydrated foods lately. Powders, when they used to rim glasses with things. You can use powdered foods in order to color frostings or cakes or noodles. If you're making pasta, you can put, anything green, any green powder in it to make green pasta. Beetroot powder can be used to turn things red. I mean, there's all sorts of ways to color things that way. One of my favorite things to do is to replace potato chips with zucchini chips that are flavored with barbecue sauce, with any kind of seasonings that I put on it. Because in the summer, when I can get them good, and then be able to dry them and have them for a little while, I will eat those things like crazy because they taste like Lay's potato chips. Not exactly, but they're a really good replacement for that crunch. And I
Okay.
still get the salty thing.
Let's talk about storage and shelf life.
Okay.
How can you maximize the shelf life of dehydrated foods?
Putting them in a dark, cool, dry place. That's the best way to do it. So under 70, it's 70 or 75 F is considered the high temperature of what perfect storage is. Not to put them in some place where you get a lot of temperature adjustment, because that can cause condensation and it's bad. You don't want to put them someplace where it's so hot that it causes the food to start to degrade. You can put them any place cold, it's no problem. But what you don't want to do is have that fluctuation that you're going back and forth, which is why I don't ever recommend storing any kind of food outside in an uncontrolled environment. So in the garage or the shed or something, I just don't recommend that ever. In a airtight container of any kind, whether it's a spaghetti jar from the grocery store, whether it's vacuum sealed in a plastic bag, or in Mylar with an O2 absorber, or in a good solid plastic container, any of those things that keep them airtight is perfect. To extend that, or to ensure that you get a little better, you can vacuum seal. And I use a little handheld vacuum sealer like this because I can do just a few jars at a time. You can have a big vacuum sealer machine if you want. If you've got that works. You can use O2 absorbers in things that you're going to store long term, like you're talking 2 or 3 years and you're not going to touch it. You can do that. It's added insurance above and beyond the airtight container. The only other thing that I would suggest is those of you who live in a really humid environment would use some moisture absorbers in the jars that you're in and out of all the time. This can help control the moisture that's added to the food. It does not take the moisture away from the food if you did not dry it properly. Always dry it properly first. This is for the added moisture from opening your jar. I use this for things like my fruit powders. I use this for foods that tend to clump up really easily because they've got a little bit of moisture in there. Like onion powder and garlic powder sometimes can clump really easily. If I'm storing it, I might keep one of these in there. But added to that, if the food gets soft in the jar while you've got it in storage, there are a couple of reasons, and this goes with storage. This is just part of the problem. It can go with sliced vegetables too. It means a couple of things. The ambient air that's already in your jar has moisture in it, and it's going to absorb a little bit of that. That's not a problem. Okay, you can put it back in the dehydrator, dry it some more, and you're fine. It's when it grows mold that's the issue, and then you toss it. You never want to let there be so much moisture that's a problem.
Okay, so if you're looking at longevity, for storage, how should dehydrated foods be packaged to ensure longevity?
Well, the same thing. An airtight
Not the
container.
in and out, where you're not going in and out. Okay.
Same thing. Airtight container. That's the basic of anything that you need, whether it's a Mylar bag, which are, what did I stick? Which are these little silvery bags right here that you put in a vacuum sealer to seal it up, or you might throw an O2 absorber in there that will actually kind of sort of vacuum it. It doesn't really all the time, but it takes out all the oxygen out of the bag, so it makes it a perfect environment for storage.
Right.
The airtight jars, that means you're not introducing air into it because their air can't get in or out. Like I said, the vacuum seal bags, or if you use a vacuum sealer on there and then keep it in a cool, dark, dry place, that will be the perfect storage for longevity. That's also the perfect storage for short term. It's perfect storage.
With short term though, if you're going to be in and out, then desiccant pack is recommended.
Only if you need it. I don't use it on most of them. I mean, you see, none of these have one. Okay. And I'm in and out of these jars a lot. It's when you have foods that are more prone to moisture, like powders that will clump easier, or if you're in an environment where there's a lot of humidity in your air all the time.
Cost and sustainability, because in today's world, it's all about cost. Okay. How do dehydrated foods contribute to reducing food waste? That's a beef line.
When you are cutting up vegetables for prepping a meal and you have leftover celery, Where does that celery usually end up? For most people, it's at the back of the refrigerator, never to get used again until it gets slimy, and then they find it, and then it goes in the trash. You prep all that food, you either put it in your refrigerator ready for the next meal you're going to use, and that way you've prepped everything at once, or your extras go in the dehydrator. When it's done, then you put it on the shelf. Yes, you're using a little bit of electricity to keep that food dry, but I always look at that as any preservation method that you do of any kind is going to use that electricity to get there. So that's not an issue.
Okay, health and safety, because I'm a safety gal. How does the dehydration process affect food safety and preservation?
Okay, so a couple of things that you have to think about. Clean utility, so make sure that your prep area is clean and your storage containers are clean. They don't have to be sterilized, but they do need to be clean. You need to dry at proper temperatures depending on the food that you're drying. So for most foods, the temperature doesn't matter. Higher temperatures means that you get it dried a little faster. You might get a little crisper depending on what it is. But if you dry it low and slow, it's fine because you're saving more nutrients. You're going to save more flavor. So drying low is no problem. But when you're talking about doing proteins, you have to have a proper temperature to make it safe because bacteria is an issue. And if you're putting meat in that dehydrator to dry, if you're drying it too low, you run the risk of every bad bacteria that's in that meat or in the air that's going to get on the meat. That's an issue. So you have to dry at proper temperatures. Then the other food safety thing for me is not leaving food out for more than 2 hours at room temperature when it's not meant to be that way. But you're talking about you've cut every vegetable open, you've exposed all the flesh to whatever is in the air in your area because that machine is not airtight. So if you leave it in your dehydrator overnight, not running, you run the risk of contracting whatever thing is in the air around you or what was already on the vegetable. You're drying it, you're putting it away, and unless you made sure that you cooked it at the proper temperature to get it high enough that you've killed that stuff, you run the risk of getting your family sick from that. But botulism is not an issue with dehydrating the way it is with canning. It's not about botulism. It's just about bacteria that'll just make you, sick for a little while. But that's so rare for dehydrated foods that it's not really an issue to have to think about. Just dry it at proper temperatures, get it dry, store it well, and you're fine.
I have 2 more for you. Are you ready?
Okay, let's go for it.
Okay, comparisons. Here we go. How do dehydrated foods compare to freeze-dried foods in terms of quality and usage?
Okay, it's 2 completely different kind of processes. So texture is the biggest thing because the texture of dehydrated foods is from heating up the food and removing the moisture from that. With freeze-dried, you freeze the food hard, then it pulls moisture out without heating the food up. It's called sublimation. It's a whole different process, which allows freeze-dried foods to look exactly like they looked when you put them in there. They don't always change the way they look. So that's why you can put a piece of lasagna in the freeze dryer, dry it, and it comes out not quite looking like lasagna, but it's still more like lasagna. You can put all those foods in there because they're safe, and that works out. With dehydrated foods, you heat it up, you pull out that moisture, and in that process, you're kind of breaking down the cells of food, which is why it shrinks. So dehydrated foods I shouldn't say never, but most dehydrated foods don't look like what they look like when you put them in. So all of these vegetables that are in this jar don't look like the vegetables like right here. Get that in there. Those are carrots. Those are carrot slices. They're this big. They're shoveled up. They look kind of weird. And so they don't look like what they look like when you put them in the machine. Now, texture also plays into it. Dehydrated foods have a totally different texture than freeze-dried foods do. Freeze-dried does come back more like fresh than dehydrated does. Not in all cases. And for me, some foods taste better dehydrated than they do freeze-dried because it's texture. For probably most of it is texture for me. But the big difference between the two, though, is the cost of getting into it. And it may not be feasible for you to get the machine because the freeze-dried machine is pretty expensive. So dehydrated can work in almost all cases. You just can't dehydrate all the same kind of foods that you can freeze-dry. So, I mean, those are the differences.
So now for the final question. In your opinion, in what scenarios are dehydrated foods the best option compared to other preserved foods?
Portability versus canning or freezing is probably the biggest thing about dehydrated foods. And the fact that I can dehydrate more foods than I can for not quality, that's not the way I want to use it. I cannot can snackable fruits like this. Okay. So I can't put an apple in a canner and then have a crunchy snack after, because it just doesn't work that way. But then I can take some of these and some of the apple rings and some other things, put them together in a little package and walk away with a snack for running out around the afternoons, or for going on the trail, or for whatever. I can pick up things dehydrated and walk away with them, and they're easier to do. So I can package a meal easier to walk away with. And I think portability, and then the fact that I can store so much more in one space with dehydrated foods than I can with canned. Now, I'm not saying that canned foods are great, because there's so much more I can do with canned foods that I cannot do with dehydrated foods, like proteins and full meals that you can't do in the same fashion. But portability and space saving and the ease of doing the process and walking away, because I can throw a few things in the dehydrator and just walk away, and that makes it so much easier. But every method has its benefits and then its drawbacks, and it just depends on what works well for you and what you're doing. I will always be a dehydrating girly. I will always be.
So I hope all of those questions helped you. But if you have more questions, be sure to watch this video right here, where it's part 2 of Leisa and I talking together about dehydrating on Leisa's channel. And until I see you again next time, happy dehydrating. And remember, nevertheless, she preserved.